I was first introduced to pixelfade and their visual novels on the 28th of May, 2020. There was a Steam discount on a bundle of their games at the time, and having been interested in playing more visual novels, I took the opportunity to snag all four. Ace Academy, the first of their games, was a delightful experience. Although hardly the most original game in the world, I truly did fall in love with the characters and the setting. It's my favorite game by them, and one of my favorite visual novels of all time. Crystalline I was less of a fan of. Never was much for fantasy settings, but I enjoyed my time with the game thoroughly, even if the impression it left was not as deep as Ace. I skipped over Kaori Afterstory since I didn't romance her in Ace Academy, and while I'm sure it'd be a blast, it was always going to be Yuna for me. The final episode for Ethereal Enigma had not yet been released upon my purchase. Being only one episode away from completion, I decided to be patient and wait for the release before playing the game. Sure enough, that final update came out in a month's time, and I dug my teeth into what was a game I was very excited for, based on the studio's previous work. And ended up leaving disappointed, confused, and dissatisfied. It had all the things I had come to expect. Good character designs, good voice acting.
Do my eyes deceive me? For once, is my cousin ready for school before I am?
And mostly good comedy, although the Karen gags are particularly unfunny.
I need to talk to the manager.
But it was missing that something. I wasn't fully able to put together what that thing was at the time. But that feeling of dissatisfaction didn't disappear, and so I revisited the game much later to try and understand why. I feel now I know. It took me long enough. So today I want to share that reasoning and hopefully put the game behind me in so doing. Now, for those unfamiliar with the genre, Ethereal Enigma is a visual novel, which is to say an interactive text-based story. Some have lots of branching choices, some have no choices at all. Ethereal Enigma sits in the middle, with quite a few choices, but only a select few that'll have any sort of outcome on the plot and characters. I'd call this a negative, because it is, but none of the pixelfade games have excelled in this department, so this is the last time I'll mention it. Now let's start with a brief rundown of the characters and plot. The MC is your generic nice guy. He lives with his aunt and uncle because his parents work overseas. Mina is our supposedly tomboyish cousin. We'll get into that later. Kosei is the game's stock best friend archetype. Kira is the adopted daughter of a massive tech conglomerate. And Erlen is the princess of Velden. You and Mina work at your aunt and uncle's bakery. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get started. The plot begins with our characters entering high school, placing their age at around 15. Not relevant now, but it will be later. We get situated in our class and are introduced to one of the game's first out of two romanceable characters, Kira Igarashi, and she's the talk of the class, although she's shy from that spotlight and the attention given to her. Eventually, the day ends and you go home, taking a different route than normal, and ending up at a shrine where an old woman urges you to make a wish, speaking about some ethereal energy. You can give in to the crazed woman's advice, or not. Not doing it ends the game right there, and it's probably the best ending, but sadly, I'll need to do otherwise for the sake of this video. You make an oddly specific wish for a princess to fall out of the sky, and that's exactly what happens. Erlen Dawn falls from above and lands on top of you, rightly confused.
Where am I?
You bring her home, convince your aunt and uncle she's a foreign exchange student your parents didn't tell them about, and there's your setup.
No.
I didn't hear about this either.
The next day, Kira tells you she knows what happened, and the two of you investigate to try and find the old woman. Several such investigations with you and Kira take place, but they all turn out fruitless, save for a Velden phrase Erlen knows, confirming the old woman was Velden.
Malinodera Malioten.
The leads go dry there, so from now on until very late in the game, everything is just going to be standard slice of life stuff with the plot occasionally popping up its head. This is an issue, seeing as the plot is not, I want to learn more about my dead parents like an Ace, where a similar thing happens, although to a lesser extent, but I am trapped away from home on a world completely foreign to me, sealed away from everyone and everything I've ever known. I suppose Erilyn takes it like a champ, but that doesn't change the fact that it's something quite important to just give up with. In any case, Erilyn runs for class rep. I guess that's her way of coping, and does the old throw candy into the crowd to win votes move, to steal the victory from an actual responsible student. I say this as someone who won the student council election against a person who tried this very trick. No one votes for the candy person. It comes off as desperate. Voting time comes, and if you're like me, your friends shame you for not voting Erilyn.
What? Seriously?
Why would you do that, my man?
But Erilyn's our friend.
That stuff about the chalk was pretty accurate.
I mean, yes, that's true.
That's where you're wrong.
You're supposed to support your friend.
She wins, and that's the end of it, really. It still gets brought up, and is in the background till the end, I suppose, but student government's time in the spotlight is over. Not long after is a school camping trip that is mostly uneventful. There is your typical pick on the girls in the hot springs scene, but it's actually entirely avoidable, and Kosei is the one to advise against it, a break from his archetype.
No way, dude! Sneaking into the girls' side never ends well. Besides, the water is so nice I never want to leave.
One noteworthy thing does occur, however. A Velden amulet is found, coinciding with the introduction of a new character, Daisuke. The connection isn't exactly subtle, and eventually you and Erilyn manage to out him as Velden himself, him claiming to have gotten stranded.
You're right. I am from Velden. My name is Malik Emery.
However, as he claims to be stranded, he cannot help. For the event that took place before this confrontation, however, a maid butler cafe. Now, I'm not going to rage against fan service here, but there's a right and wrong way to do it, as my opinion. Having the characters dress up as less than modest maids, especially Erilyn, in order to drive up business for their parents, or their friends' parents' cafe for whatever reason, sounds just a bit like exploiting kids for the sake of business. I don't know. Maybe that's just me, reading a bit too much into things, but if this was a school event, it'd be a tad less weird. At least then the people being served would be roughly the same age. Now, if you thought all that was barren with stuff that had anything to do with the actual plot, you ain't seen nothing yet, as now pretenses of advancing the plot have been completely abandoned. And as for Erilyn calmly foregoing investigation in a pretty dire situation, that also gets worse, as Daisuke tells us he has a lead that he'll be investigating over the weekend, and instead of, I don't know, overseeing that, checking on him, perhaps even without his knowledge, the cast decides to spend the weekend at the beach. What? Talk about priorities. If I didn't know any better, I'd say Erilyn doesn't want to leave. Which, I mean, maybe makes sense if you romanced her, but otherwise...
In that case, tell me as soon as you find something.
The beach excursion is your run-of-the-mill beach episodes. No real complaints, but nothing else to really say about it. Other than the fact that Mina and Kosei, the pair that never stop butting heads, are now together. Who would have guessed? After coming home, a lot more nothing happens, including a bowling scene, which, while not all that good, was original. Never heard of a bowling episode before. Breaking new ground. But not long after that, the plot starts picking up again, with Daisuke revealing he was not a hapless soul, but in fact was sent here to look over Erilyn, as her aunt had sent her here on purpose. He doesn't know why she did it, but he does know that our aunt is secretly Velden, and that she knows.
All I know is that she is a part of this operation.
So we come home, enlightened, and reveal the news that we know her secret to our aunt. She tells us that Erilyn was sent here to learn to be more mature, and that her and our uncle knew full well that she was not an exchange student from Sweden.
Sorry, kiddo, I don't mean to laugh. But a foreign exchange student just randomly shows up at the house with no prior notice, no luggage, and the day before school starts?
Erilyn is set to go home soon, so the group decides to have a karaoke night to send her off. All goes swimmingly, and Erilyn returns home. Now, just from hearing all of that, you've probably already noticed that the plot is issued. It comes and goes at random points, and for that reason, it ends very abruptly and strangely. But we've only gone over the broad strokes. It only falls apart further once we delve deeper into the characters that make up this narrative. So, let's start from the best offenders to the worst. I'm going to talk about your aunt and uncle in the same section, since they have the same issues, or issue, really. The reveal that they knew about everything was not entirely surprising or out of nowhere. The way that Erilyn was introduced to the family unit was very convenient for the player, let's just say. However, that aside, that reveal doesn't really recontextualize any of the interactions that they have with you throughout the game. If Erilyn had gotten into the home in a more natural manner, I doubt there would have been anything to show that they knew. And that's a crying shame, since there's a lot that could be done there. Mina's main issue is the difference between how she's characterized and how the writers think she's characterized.
Or maybe it's because you act too much like a boy.
In the game, she's a pretty feminine girl. She has some masculine hobbies, sure, but she also has a pretty long interaction with Erilyn about makeup, so I'd hardly call her a tomboy. The writers think she's one though, and so there's a lot of jokes based upon that fact. Jokes that don't work because, well, she's not a tomboy.
Do you think that would work on mine?
Another issue, or at least a missed opportunity, is what happens when it's revealed that her mother is Veldin. She doesn't have to come to terms with that fact, and in fact it changes very little about her output on life and how she trusts her parents after they lied to her for this long. She just kinda goes, wow, that's cool, and goes on with her life. Kosei is a good execution of the best friend archetype, although I do have a bias for these kinds of characters. The issue with his character, though, is the amount of depth that the writers seemingly tried to give him, but didn't really do anything with. His family has a poor financial situation, and this is brought up at least a couple of times. But there's never any resolution, and in fact, it doesn't pose that much of a problem for his daily life.
Wow, you must have worked a lot of overtime during this kind of money. Uh-oh. What'd I get myself into? Thank you.
I suppose that's good for him, but it's an issue when this story that's already devoid of conflict is removing even more conflict that could have been present. All that being said, the interactions between him, Mina, and the player character are my favorite parts of the game. So this is where we go from characters with some issues to characters with a lot of issues. Kira Igarashi. A character whom I like, but one whose inclusion could not be more out of place. She feels like she comes from an entirely different game. A good one maybe, but still. Her introduction to the plot and friend group is extremely weak, and I really think that the writers could have done better if they wanted to introduce a secondary romance option. She says she saw what happened, wants to investigate out of pure curiosity, I guess. Does so, but even after the investigation goes cold, she sticks around for some reason. Considering she's supposed to be shy and a loner and someone who has trouble with people, this couldn't feel more out of character. She just feels out of place in all the scenes she's in for that reason. As it is, her route is enjoyable. I liked it myself. But it's completely disconnected from the plot. However bare bones that already is. Dating Kira feels like you are completely disconnected from anything that happens. And worse yet, not dating her feels like she's completely irrelevant to what happens and is just tagging along so that the voice actors and artists' talent aren't wasted. Even if it goes against her character for that to happen. Probably the most disappointing thing about her is the parallels between her and Erilyn that are just never explored. I don't even think they're even mentioned. Kira is the daughter of a massive tech conglomerate. Erilyn is the daughter of the regents of a kingdom, a princess. It's not a stretch to see the similarities here, right? Heirs of state and commerce. It feels so obvious and like something that would at least be used as a joke, but it's not. It makes me question if one's even meant to see the parallels, and if they aren't, well, then I guess we know the writer's type. Erilyn. Oh boy. Where to start? Erilyn is a very confusing character, considering her regal status, arrogant and pompous attitude, and the situation she finds herself winding up in this world. One would expect her arc to be a stereotypical story about being humbled and learning to be less stuck up, about becoming a better person. That's not what happens, though, which might sound like a good thing. It ignores the tropes of the archetype, but it doesn't replace them with anything. So what you're left with is a character who is in this world to learn and develop, but at the same time, never actually learns and develops, and perhaps doesn't even need to. To fully explain what I mean, I'll be providing some examples. Near the very beginning of the game, Erilyn has trouble making a sandwich. This is the only thing I can recall that she struggles at. She's otherwise so skilled culinarily to give sound advice to your uncle, a professional baker, that ends up improving a dish of his significantly. This could have worked. Maybe she's great at a lot of things, but some things, simple stuff like sandwich making, escapes her. But besides that scene at the beginning, we never actually see her struggle and learn to make the sandwich good. It's brought back up at the end with her amazing sandwich, but we never actually see the development. We never actually see her learn. During that same scene where we get her new and improved sandwich, Erilyn thanks us for teaching her empathy, to go out of her comfort zone, and to be more self-sufficient. Only one of these is sorta true. Yes, she's very mean and rude at the start of the game, but that's only really to us, the main character. Never is her empathy shown to be lacking with any other member of the cast, even a background character. In fact, she gets along great with Mina from the start, the opposite of apathetic. So hearing her say this just felt really bizarre. Similarly, there isn't much of anything in terms of her getting out of her comfort zone. I guess being transported to another world and the new challenges and customs that come with it can be described as that much, but that was more her aunt than you. Credit where credit is due. In terms of self-sufficiency, there is a scene where she begins to work at the bakery to earn her keep, so I suppose that part works. We'd be forgiven if you'd forgotten that scene or just assumed she'd learned that lesson on her own. Only 1/3 of the things she says we helped her learn are true, and that one is barely expanded on. Anyway, if it wasn't obvious enough, she is generally hyper-competent at most, if not everything, including socially. Really the only thing she struggles with, and massively so, is humility. That's the lesson she needs to learn, not to be more empathetic. But she's never humbled outside of the sandwich scene, and it's not even brought up in her line about how much the MC taught her. This creates further issue with the plot, as now the inciting incident was pointless. It makes her aunt seem like she was off her rocker for sending her niece to another world to learn these things. She never actually needed to learn any of them. And that tendency of bringing up issues, or at least the possibility of issues, only to shoot them down, is the same way the game approaches monarchy, or the monarchy of Velden at least. Now I know it might sound like I'm getting political, but if I do, that's only because this game started it. Early on in the game, when Erilyn proves herself to be so intelligent as to be several orders of magnitude more knowledgeable in mathematics than what I'm pretty sure is covered in all of high school, I told you she was arrogant. She goes on to gloat about how much smarter Veldeners are and how much better their lives are. Reasonably, you have the option to point out that she's the princess, and that while her life might be all the better for her, for the common people things are a little less perfect and their education a little less stellar. Not only does she deny that fact, but she does it straight-faced and maturely admits the few privileges she does have. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong for her to deny it. In fact, it'd be odd if she admitted it, but the fact she dismisses it so easily and maturely admits what she does have kind of goes in the face of the idea that she's pampered and that she needs to learn to be mature. No, instead we gather the idea that her life isn't all that better. She's not pampered, she's not spoiled, she hasn't had all that much privilege, and whatever privilege she has had is not something that has gotten in the way of her matureness. Having that means that if she needed to go to another world to be mature, basically every teenager from Velden would have to go to be mature, because they all had roughly equal privilege, apparently. And it'd be another thing if we got contradictory information, be it from Daisuke or Aunt Emiko, seeing as they're both also Velden, but neither are royalty. If, despite her confidence, she was wrong. No, she actually was spoiled and did have it quite good. But no, that's the last time this idea so much as entertained, and that's if you can call this entertaining the idea. Now, considering how hard I've ripped into the characters, most notably the main girl of the game, you might be surprised to hear I actually like some of the ideas of the story. I think they have a lot of potential, and that's what makes their poor execution or outright ignoring so frustrating. But instead of just talking about how good they could be, I'm gonna try working them into a revised story to show the potential they could have and how these ideas could have been expanded upon, changing as little in terms of overall plot as possible. The story would start the same way. The setup would remain unchanged, with the exception that we've known Kira since before the events of the story. That's really the only way to make sense of her inclusion without much larger changes. Instead of instantly meshing well with the friend unit, Erlen has some trouble fitting in and is off-putting, rude, and mean to Kosei. His poverty and the disadvantages that's brought him is something that Erlen can't empathize with, being unable to come to terms with the fact that she has it better than many others, including him. Erlen can still remain competent at most things. She can still find math trivial, and can still be very mean about that fact. But now, instead of that meanness only really manifesting towards a protagonist and therefore being easy to write off, it's something that we watch as she treats another character equally, if not even more poorly. Moving away from Erlen for a bit, Kira should have a bigger role in the overarching plot, and should be around for more reasons than just because. Instead of just existing and not even being mentioned, the parallels between her and Erlen should be the reason for her inclusion in the story, and for that reason, Erlen should find it very easy to hang out with and empathize with her, more than she can with anyone else, especially Kosei, at least at first. Erlen would hang out with her during her free time, and would perhaps bring along the main character during some of these excursions. On one such occasion, though, either one that we hear about, or, even better, we were there for, things that they have in common start running dry when it comes to their parents. Kira has a pretty troubled relationship with her parents. Erlen's is not so troubled, and so whenever Kira explains or tries to talk about that issue, Erlen is unable to empathize with it. It's the main character's role in all of this to guide her into stepping out of her comfort zone, to try to put herself in Kira's shoes. It wouldn't be easy. In fact, it'd take multiple scenes before she truly felt comfortable doing so. But eventually, she learns. And during that process, she finds herself getting along much better with Kosei, even perhaps promising to come back to give him Velden riches once she finds her way home. A promise she ends up keeping, regardless of if you romanced her or not. Similarly, instead of just running for student council just because, she does it because the main character was pushing her towards doing something that she enjoys, and something she takes interest in: leadership. The election is more turbulent. She even considers dropping out. It's only thanks to the main characters, and really all of her friends, that she's able to persevere and win. Learning the value of doing things that you wouldn't normally do, that aren't easy, and that perhaps stress you out. And finally, for Erlen, a change that I think would be the most simple would be an expansion of the sandwich plotline. Instead of just being brought up at the beginning and then brought up at the end, it's instead a longer line about her coming to realize that while she is great at a lot of things, she isn't perfect, and that she still has things to learn. At first, the fact that something as simple as sandwiches makes her feel like it gets beneath her, but over time and over multiple scenes, she learns the value and basic skills like it, and that she should not be that arrogant. For how she acts in the back half of the game, nothing really needs to change. She's already in the changed state by then. It's just that in the original story, this changed state comes about with any actual reason for change. If there's one thing I could suggest, it would be to make it happen just a bit later, but that's it really. Now in terms of Kira, I've already admitted that I quite like her romance route. The biggest issue with it is its lack of relation with the plot. So I feel the easiest thing to do here is to build off those group hangouts with Erlen, Kira, and the main character, and leave opportunities there to take sides, and take one of them, Kira in this case of course, aside. You can keep a lot of the solo stuff, but this could replace some of it. Did we really need the cat girl scene? I think it would go a long way in tying her more to the plot than she currently is. As for the overarching plot about sending Erlen home, I think it's pretty simple. Pace out the reveals better instead of just having some at the beginning, a middle section that goes nowhere, and then dumping it all onto us at the end. Instead, we can learn that Aunt Emiko was Velden in more of the midpoint of the story, and Mina would have had to grapple with her Velden inheritance. Perhaps she'd be in denial of it. Perhaps her trust in her parents would be shattered because of it. Maybe even straining or strengthening her relationship with Kosei, depending on if it's after or before they start dating. It becomes its own plotline about her coming to terms with the fact that ultimately they hid it from her for her own sake, and that even if it wasn't the right thing to do, they did it because they loved her and didn't want her to feel like she was different from everyone else. Ending with a heartwarming scene of her forgiving them and the family coming together. Maybe in a good old-fashioned group hug. And or having a plotline where you and Erlen, or maybe even you alone, stalk Daisuke to find out what he's really about. Even in the original game, you hold your suspicions about him even after his initial outing, so this wouldn't really be out of line. Eventually you discover his ties to the Royal Guard, perhaps even during an interaction with Erlen's aunt. The two of you can confront him about this, and that's why he comes clean. And that's where Erlen's aunt's motivation is revealed. This would also aid in the fact that Erlen doesn't seem to care much about the fact that she's stranded on Earth, because now she would be actively investigating throughout the whole story, instead of just the beginning. Speaking of aunts, seeing as your Aunt Emiko and Uncle Hajime know of your aunt's motivations and reasons for sending Erlen here, it'd be a nice touch if throughout the story they nudge and help with the changes that the story would be revised to have. Either helping Erlen directly, or, even better, having the player consult them for their advice on what they should do. The player being oblivious to the fact that the advice is in fact meant to bring about some of that change. This would leave something for the player to think back to and go, oh, that's why. And on subsequent playthroughs, they'd have a different light on the interactions. Just remove the maid cafe scene outright, seeing as there's pretty much no place in the game or story, and is kind of weird. And we changed the friend hangouts like the bowling session to reflect more of the conflicts that we've now established. We could have things like Erlen skipping out on some hangouts because of shame, or Kira because of shyness. Kosei could go from being a bit down and uncomfortable hanging out with Erlen around, only to later become quite close and cheery with her due to her newfound empathy. And for the final change, the ending needs to feature Erlen's aunt. Having this all be about her plan, have Erlen being forced to grow as a person is really undersold when we don't even get a confrontation with her. A chance for her to see how the plan, however much we voice our disagreement with, succeeded, or not, maybe. It wouldn't be a long interaction. In fact, she shouldn't be in the story too long, or else it would ruin the mystique. But it'd be enough for us to understand why she felt she had to do what she did. And with all that, I think that the story and characters from this game could be improved substantially. Wouldn't be amazing, but the ideas present already lend themselves towards creating something good, and I think what I came up with is at least better than what we got. Overall, coming off the high of Ace Academy and Crystalline, this game took out much of the best in those games and doubled down on their worst aspects. None of the games had very good plots, and they all had pretty bad endings. But it's here where the plots go from barely serviceable to just downright bad. Add a character that is extremely unlikable, and you leave the game with a bad taste on your tongue. It's not a terrible game. In fact, even after complaining about it as much as I did, I have a hard time calling it bad. There's just so much potential and good ideas at play, and ultimately, most of the characters are likable. But too much gets sidelined for cliches and tropes of the genre, making the game ultimately subpar. A 3 out of 10. Moving away from Carolyn for a bit, character. I mean, she is a character, so yeah, character. Good name.